among other funny things that happened on that day, in addition to the tragic events, there are quite a few things that happened that are kind of odd on that day. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theories or the idea that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by a particle beam weapon from space, or the Illuminati or anything else. Just some easily observable phenomena. So I want to talk about some of the other known anomalies for a moment, and then the geomagnetic fields, both in Alaska, where I was first pointed to, and elsewhere, and then possible mundane explanations and perhaps some speculative explanations that might be relevant, and a little discussion. As it says here, I'm not trying to prove anything. This is far from being a completed study of anything. I'm just trying to encourage further investigations. As you know, theories are a dime a dozen, and proofs are a lot harder to come by. That's from the great Sidney Harris, I'm sure many of you recognize. Some known anomalies that many of you have studied or know about. The Global Consciousness Project, of course, random number generators went a little bit wacky just before the events of September 11th, and there's a lot to be said about that. Our online site called gotsci.org, there was some anomalies in the card guessing hit rate during that time, or just previous to 9/11. Dean Radin found also that some free associated keywords typed into one of those little tests showed a surprising drop in the number of violence, disaster, terrorist-related terms during the period just before 9/11. It is true that there were some stock market activities that were kind of questionable. Some people did really short airline stocks in the week before September 11th. We're told that the 9/11 Commission looked into this very carefully, and I believe some other people did as well, and found the trades to be innocuous with no suspicious motivations or connections or anything. Just people felt like it was a good time to sell the airline stocks, or they were using their psi, using their intuition to do so. There have been a lot of precognitive dreams and visions relating to 9/11. There's a few dozen of them on our website. I have to tell you that I've heard two new precognitive dream stories just since I've been here among this audience, and not from people you might expect necessarily either. Here's one of my interpretations of the 9/11 random number generator date. This is not necessarily endorsed by Roger or anybody else, but the events are in red, and this is the movement of the generators starting pretty clearly about 4 hours before the events. Enough has been said about that. The card guessing game, as some of you know, is a 5-card force choice guessing game. You just try to determine which card has the picture on it. As of this morning, we have probably 60 or 70 million trials in the can on that test alone, and a total of 144 million on all of the tests, and nobody has time to really analyze it thoroughly. We don't have the support to do that, but here's the card test daily hit rate from 2000 to April of 2005. You can see there's a huge notch in that hit rate, and that was just 2 weeks prior to 9/11. People got incredibly bad at guessing these cards. Z of -3. This is a filtered waveform, of course, but it's Z of -3 essentially for 2 weeks before 9/11. Then it returned to normal shortly thereafter. I can't show it on this diagram, but there are effects in this data that persist for a year after the 9/11 deviations. On to the magnetometers. This is a very high quality instrument that's typically used by the geomagnetic community. 3-axis flux gate magnetometer, 3 orthogonal coils basically, and they are used at these various stations in Alaska as well as around the world, and also similar designs are flying in various spacecraft. Let's remind ourselves of the event times, the major events of 9/11. The first strike of the World Trade Center tower was at 12:46 Universal Time. Then the second plane hit the second tower, then a third plane hit the Pentagon. Then the second tower fell, then a fourth plane crashed in Pennsylvania, then the first tower fell at 14:29. So this gray area is our area of interest, and this is, of course, universal time throughout the entire 9/11 day. So here's the first magnetometer I looked at, Fort Yukon in the center of Alaska. Nice big glitch in the middle there, some definite changes in the character of the curve. Well, there's the events right there. So that seems somewhat remarkable to me because there's a real impulse centered directly on the very first event and a huge deviation centered directly on the last event, and then a considerable change in the character of the curve, a minor geomagnetic storm, a lot more noise and variance and so forth. So this seemed like an interesting correspondence, so I started to look around at other magnetometers. Here's Poker Flats, just another place in Alaska, very similar sort of thing. Much farther north in Alaska at Barrow, here we see somewhat different but still similar sort of a curve. These variations are nothing special. They're not larger than anything typical. They just happen to be at these particular times. Here's Los Alamos, New Mexico, two big inflections at the beginning and the end of the events, and a big fall in between. Fredericksburg, Maryland, quite a bit different, but still bottoms out right at the end of the events, and there's a transition. This is much coarser data, as you can see. Peru, something funny happening in the middle there, and again, another big transition right at the end of the events. China, similar, although smaller in magnitude. Lebanon, very similar, but a great distance away. Greenland, quite a bit different, but there's still something going on in that area there. Ethiopia, a big pedestal that looks sort of like the inverse of the other curve. Antarctica, where it's quieter than any place else except for the Earth's geomagnetic field. So there's a big drop there. It seems like something's going on all over the planet, and in various degrees. There's, in particular, a big transition just at the end of these events. Why that might be the case, I have no idea. It could be just a big coincidence. But this rules out lots of local sources that one might imagine, or, HARP, or a bunch of radars turning on, or anything that's localized and deliberate. And furthermore, the transition started right at the beginning, exactly at the first strike. You would think if there were some military response being recorded here, that would take a little while to happen. So I don't think there's any particular evidence of something nefarious going on here or anything localized. Let's look out in space at the magnetometer on GOES 8, which is, as you know, a geosynchronous satellite, so it's about 22,000 miles away from the Earth. And there's a pretty clear pedestal in the geomagnetic field right there. And again, a big transition right at the end of the events. So that's all, again, consistent with ordinary fluctuations in the geomagnetic field. You see it in space as well. We could look at the solar wind, which is, of course, the source of much of, or if not all of the variations in the local magnetic field. And there's a huge spike right at the end there in the solar wind, the proton densities at the GOES satellite. This is 5-minute data, by the way, was all I could find, whereas the other was 1-minute data, and so this might be even delayed a little by the filtering, I don't know. Let's go a little farther out in space. As you know, there are some satellites called ACE and SOHO out at L1, the first Lagrangian point, which is on a direct line between the Earth and the Sun. And these are about 1 million miles away, and they're monitoring the solar wind and various other things, including the interplanetary magnetic field, which this is. You can see a gigantic transition right in the middle of around the 1300 hour there. I'll remind you that on Earth, here is the biggest transition area, the end of the 9/11 events at 1430. So that's about 75 minutes early. Well, 75 minutes turns out to be the time that it takes the solar wind to get from L1 to the Earth. In fact, if you take the actual spacecraft parameters on that day and calculate the distance and divide that by the actual solar wind measured at L1 that day, you get 75 minutes. So it's interesting that this was a day of particularly long time to Earth. This is 3 months, actually 3 solar rotations, about 3 months, worth of the transit time calculated from the distance of the spacecraft and including the solar wind velocity for that day. And just at the beginning of 9/11 or 9/10 really, the spacecraft was a little farther away than usual and the solar wind was quite a bit slower than usual. So for no good reason, the transit time of those protons and other junk to Earth was almost twice as long as the average, which is more around 50 minutes, 50 or 60 minutes, as you can see on the left side of the diagram there. Well, let's look at the solar wind density again in a bigger view, this 3-month view or 3 solar rotations view. The peak of interest is this one in the center, and you can see it's not particularly unusual. There are a number of peaks here that are within this 3-month period that are equal or greater in magnitude. But again, it's right in the middle and centered within a minute or two of the end of these events. It is also the largest peak within that particular solar rotation, the middle third of the picture. So we could get a crude probability for how likely it is just by counting the number of similar or greater peaks in this 3-month period and dividing that into buckets that are the size of the synchronization that we think we're seeing here. And just sort of as a preliminary or crude estimate of the probability, there are roughly 10 events in 11,000 10-minute periods. We think the synchronization is a lot better than 10 minutes, but let's be conservative and say 10 minutes. That would be on its own, just for that one part of the waveform, a probability of less than 1,000 to 1. So it's interesting, but certainly not evidential of anything in particular. As you can see, it's not a terribly unusual deviation on the whole. But I remind you that there was a big impulse right at the beginning of these events, and particularly in Alaska, a large deviation at the end of the events within a very short time period of synchronization. So this, to me, sounds like one of these things that's just too much of a coincidence, even though it's perfectly possible to have happened by chance alone. So there were these geomagnetic field disturbances. They were somewhat typical, but surprisingly coincident, I would say. They were not only in Alaska, but globally, not only terrestrial, but seen also in near-Earth satellites, and ones at a million miles away at L1, and seen as would be typical for disturbances of this kind. They were also seen in the solar wind proton density and velocity. But that data seems to imply that an eruption occurred on the sun, traveled to Earth, and globally disturbed the local geomagnetic field just at several moments of highly significant human events. In other words, the sun burped at just the right time so that 3 days later or so, these things lined up with the human events yet to come. Big coincidence? Well, yeah, it is a big coincidence, but I think there's too many of these. So anyway, we've ruled out a lot of these conspiratorial theories and ordinary mundane explanations. It really wasn't military radars. HAARP has sometimes been called by someone the Moby Dick of conspiracy theorists. HAARP was not even turned on at that time. Cell phones, power glitches, radios, military hardware, even unknown, just don't fit the data here. This really seems to be an effect attributable to ordinary solar activity, but at exactly the right moments. You think that was just one coincidence? Well, okay, what happened on September 6, 1997? Here's a 3-day period. It looks kind of quiet throughout, except for one big spike in the middle of September 6th. Who remembers what happened that day? Any Brits? Exactly centered, that 1-hour period was exactly centered on this deviation in the geomagnetic field at the same place in Alaska, or one of the same stations. 2.5 billion viewers are said to have watched the funeral, and that was a significant portion of the entire human population of the Earth. But if you look in a bigger picture, here's that peak. Again, it's not very big, it just happens to be precisely centered in the middle of a big silent area. That was her funeral. Where was her death? It was over here. This is a 2-week plot now. nothing significant over there, but if you do look closely, there's a little glitch in a big quiet period, and I haven't shown that, but it's pretty, it would be stretching things a bit to say that this rather small deviation had something to do with her death. So it's a mixed bag, and let's just think for a moment, if this were extraordinary as it seems, what could be some extraordinary explanations? Well, some sort of retrocausal or experimenter effect, some kind of consciousness, disturbance in the force. I don't know. You can speculate a lot about this, but to me what's important about this is there are too many coincidences, even with pretty objective viewpoints, and this causes us to question our assumptions about causality and randomness. And the horse I've been riding for many years is exactly this, that the equations of physics are pretty much time symmetric, and therefore we ought to see influence from the past to the future, past to the present, as well as from the future to the present. In fact, I think speculatively, what I always say is that events in the present, I think, are determined by events and conditions in the past and those in the future. And even in mainstream literature these days, you can see papers purporting to show that entanglement in the present can be brought about by interactions in the past as well as interactions in the future. So if you have an psi experiment with a subject and a target generator, and there's an interaction with those data streams in the future, it's possible to create an entanglement which gives rise to extraordinary correlations back in the present. I simply recommend this viewpoint to you as a way of thinking about delayed choice, quantum eraser, lots of other quantum phenomena. EPR begins to make a lot more sense if you take this point of view. So I want to thank some people with whom I've had helpful discussions about this subject, and list some of my data sources in case others want to look at the data. I'll put these slides up on my website tonight or tomorrow. And I see by the giant clock on the wall down the street, a mile from here, is it? Or 2 miles from here? That my time is up. This is the U.S. frequency standard for time accurate to 1 second in 60 million years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those who would like to ask questions, if you could come up here, up front to the mic, that would be great.
Oh, and if you order now, I'll throw in one extra chart. What happened on November 22nd, 1963? Pretty quiet except for that peak right there.
Thank you for the segue into my comment, but since you brought up the GOES satellite data,
yes.
Are you familiar with the big upset in the X-ray data of the GOES data from the Indonesian tsunami and several other earthquakes since then?
Only vaguely. I'd like to know more about that.
The data was quite, well, it's noisy as you would look at it, and as far as I know, that satellite data is now offline. It's been retired as of last year or so, but the data might be available somewhere. But it was just sort of noisy, and then a couple hours after the Indonesian earthquake and tsunami, it just started going crazy, several orders of magnitude, and lasted for days until it settled down. And so I watched that satellite data for a number of significant earthquakes reported in the news for a couple of years after that. By golly, it was tracking. So there is some interaction between the Earth and the sun, whether it's psychological or physical, I don't know, but it's
the data seems to be available, in particular to all the GOES satellites. If you want to look back as far as you want to go,
I'll do a data capture of that one for the Indonesian.
I'll have to move this on to the next questioner.
Okay.
We only have a minute left, so if you could make your question short, please.
Your investigation into entanglement, past to present or future to present, does that shed some light on possible cause and effect reversal, that the effect can take place before the cause?
Yeah, I think entanglement is only explained if you have symmetrical cause and effect, sort of my view of it, and I think, yes, it explains a lot.
The one thing I'm particularly interested in the graphs you showed is that there is an increased variance in practically all of those things.
Yes.
Do you have any explanation of that?
No, and I haven't really looked at variance yet. I haven't done another thing I would like to do, which is play the GCP events against the geomagnetic data. I haven't looked at the Indonesian earthquake, for example, at all. There's a million things that could be done at this point, and variance is a darn good one. I think it's, as you have shown, an important indicator of something going on with randomness.
Do you have an idea of the odds against chance that this would occur?
Well, overall, I don't know, and I don't claim to be able to calculate it. I gave that one crude estimate, but that really doesn't capture, in fairness, what's going on, and I don't have a good way to do that. Maybe somebody has better suggestions for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Smith. We have another philosopher. He is a philosopher.